Conestoga wagon and the Pennsylvania rifle originated here in Lancaster County in two areas very close to each other, not more than 12 miles apart. And it was James Logan, who was a representative of William Penn in Penn's Woods here, that used horses to take pack horses to take supplies to Indian trading posts here in Lancaster County. There were several of them, and one of them was at Conestoga. And what would they trade with the Indians? The most important things, objects to a person in colonial America, was an axe and a gun. And the most important pieces of property for a Native American was an axe and a gun, because they didn't have iron and steel to work with. They had stone. And so James Logan would bring some supplies from England, and he would bring them on pack horses and take them to a little town of Conestoga, about 20 miles from where we're standing, probably less than 20 miles. And what did he bring? He brought something like this. This was an axe. This is made in 1600s in England, and this is called an Indian trade axe. This is not an American axe. It was made in England. I have a collection of more than 60 antique axes, and this is perhaps the most valuable one and the rarest one. And so he brought supplies here, and he would use his pack horses. It's 60 miles from Lancaster to Philadelphia. The oldest turnpike in America is from Philadelphia to Lancaster. It was started in 1772, and stock was sold at public auction to build the road. And of course, it wasn't anything like the roads are today. And the reason that it was sold as stock is because that's the only way that they could subscribe money to pay for the road. And because it was sold at auction, that is considered the beginning of the stock exchange that we have in America today. Well, James Logan came with his pack horses, and one day he found a man in a little town of Conestoga that had a wagon, and he called it a Conestoga wagon because that's where it was made. And he wrote in his diary of December 31st, 1717, that he bought a wagon for a fill horse and from a James Hendricks. Now, a fill horse means that it was a one-horse wagon, but that's an archaic word. Fill is an archaic word, which means it was a one-horse wagon. It went between a pair of sheds. But the wagons here that were developed later on got bigger and bigger because they had to haul supplies to the frontier. And James Logan was the first one to mention the word Conestoga wagon. And the other object that was so important to us and the nation was the Pennsylvania rifle that was developed by a man named Martin Milan. He was a gunsmith, and that has a long barrel, and it had a rifle barrel, unlike the other barrels of guns from England and France. And unfortunately, these guns were used all over the East here, and they were taken to Kentucky. And that's why they were later called the Kentucky rifle, which is a misnomer. I'm sorry to tell you that, because it still should be known as the Pennsylvania rifle. And it had a rifled barrel. That meant that it didn't have a smooth bore, and they were able to shoot the ball much further, more accurately than with the smooth bore rifles. To get back to the Conestoga wagon, this is a freight vehicle. This one was used to haul supplies to Washington's troops at Valley Forge in 1777 and 78 from this part of the Pennsylvania, and it is probably the most historic vehicle in America. And it definitely is the most historic Conestoga wagon in America. And What we know about these is that they were a freight vehicle. They were not a passenger vehicle. They were used to haul supplies and freight as James Logan first started out using them. And there became more and more of them that were built. And they've been built and used for more than 150 years. These wagons, this wagon that you're looking at, has a toolbox. That's a beautiful toolbox. It also has these very high wheels, large wheels. The bigger the wheels, the easier they go. The smaller the wheels, it's the more difficult to pull it. And these had to go over stumps. They had to go over roots. They had to go over. They could go through water 3 feet deep. They didn't have bridges sometimes where these wagons went. That's why they're so high. Also, they had a curvature. Many of them have a curvature in the bed. That's to keep the load from shifting from one end to another when they're going up and down over the steep hills and the mountains. Just like today, if you look at the fuel trucks and the milk trucks, they're all cylindrical, or mostly all cylindrical, to keep the center of gravity down here. And these wagons were way ahead of their time in that way. Also, they carried an axe up front here. I guess there's not one in there, is there? There's an axe holder up there. They carried an axe in there. They didn't have, if a limb blew down or a tree fell in their path, they could just simply take that axe out of there and remove the tree. These wagons were pulled by 4 horses and as many as 6 horses. And here you're looking at a saddle. If there are 6 horses in a row, why, the smartest horse is the one up front on the left. That's the lead horse. The one on the right-hand side is called the offside horse. And so the teamster would sit on the horse in this saddle next to the wagon here, closest to the wagon. And the horses had bells on top of their harness and top of their hames. There were 5 each on the first 2 animals, 4 each on the middle 2 horses, 3 each on the 2 horses closest to the wagon. This is called the wheel horse that was right here. And the lead horse was way up front on the left. That's the smartest horse. Now, if you see stagecoach drivers today driving a team in movies or television, the teamster's sitting up there and he has 12 lines in his hands, 2 for each animal. But when these fellas drove 6 horses, they had 1 line. Here it is. It's called that horse was called a single line leader. This is called the jerk line because he could talk to that horse. This is split. This line is split over at the back of the head so that part of that goes on the right-hand side of the horse's mouth bit and the other half on the left-hand side. And so if he'd say G, G, he'd pull on it smoothly, slowly, and the lead horse would direct the other horse and would go to the right. If he'd say haw, he'd give quick jerks. That's why it's called the jerk line. And there would be this stick, wrapped metal, that would go from the bit or the chest of the lead horse to the bit of the offside horse. Wasn't that smart? That shows that whatever the lead horse did, the offside horse had to follow. So that's called a jockey stick. That takes the place of a jockey or a person. Here we have some of the housing, and you can see some of the material. There's the collar, and the hames, H-A-M-E-S, and the bells fit into the top of the hames, over top of this housing. And many times, these pieces of housing would have a man's initials on here, the owner's initials. That's so that as later on, when there were many, many wagons traveling on these roads, why they had to stay at a tavern overnight or sometimes. They put hobbles on the horses. There's some hobbles. They didn't have a corral to put horses in. Suppose there'd be 6 or 7 teamsters stop at one tavern to stay overnight. Six teamsters at 6 horses. That's 36 horses. They didn't have wire fences to keep them in. They put these hobbles around the ankles of the horses so that they couldn't run away. And in the morning, they'd take them off and hitch up. And what they did, a lot of times, they'll have the owners and teamsters' initials on here in metal. Ours happens to be AR. And is it over here? Want to hold that around there? Turn that around so you can see it. There. Good. There's a teamster's initials, you see. That's the same thing as our license plates are on our cars and trucks today. So this tells you whose harness they was. So that in the morning, if somebody got up at 5 o'clock in the morning, 4:30, let's say, real early, and wanted to get going, so he couldn't pick up somebody else's harness and be off with it. You see how smart that was? Just like our license plate identify our vehicles today. Okay? These wagons would haul anywhere between 3 to 5 tons, depending on what they haul. They haul material mostly in barrels. And these were not passenger wagons. A number of years ago, an executive from a local industry here called me and said, Art, we're going to have George Bush come to town in a week or two. Could we use your Conestoga wagon for him to ride in? I said, yes and no. He said, what do you mean? I said, the Conestoga wagon was a freight vehicle. I said, he would look very strange standing up in a Conestoga wagon like this. We couldn't have the cover on, or they couldn't see him. I said, he looked very foolish standing up in there, being driven around in Lancaster City. I said, I'll tell you what. I said, I have a beautiful Surrey with a fringe on top that I think would be more appropriate. He said, we'll use that. And when George Bush came to town, and my son, Art, when Mr. Bush came and met Art with his horse and carriage in Lancaster and got in it, he said to my son, now I'm really riding in style. He couldn't have said that if he was riding in a freight vehicle in the Conestoga wagon. Although, if people were traveling away from Lancaster County, like they did to go down to Virginia and into the Carolinas and into Kentucky, when they took their possessions, I'm sure if there was a disabled member in the family that couldn't walk, or a woman that was expecting a baby, or for some other reason, that they could possibly find room for somebody. But normally it was a freight vehicle and wasn't used just for passengers. And it was a signer of the Declaration of Independence that came here to Lancaster rather regularly, and he wrote in his diary in the 1700s that during the months of September and October, he would pass as many as 150 Conestoga wagons. And so these were used as freight vehicles, and the produce was brought from Philadelphia here to Lancaster County, and it spread westward and south, as you well know. And so this is what helped to start our country on its path to, because Pennsylvania, especially Lancaster County, was the breadbasket of the colonies right here. New England had rocky soil and lots of trees. And at the time of the Revolution, there were more German people living in Philadelphia than any other part of the colonies. And at the time of the Revolution, Philadelphia was the largest populated city outside in the British colony, outside of the city of London. And this was a great piece of woodwork, and a great piece of the blacksmith. I wrote a little book called Conestoga Wagon, masterpiece of the blacksmith. And you notice that here, now this is broken out here, and we're not going to fix this because if we put new boards on there, that would devalue this. But you see here, there's indentations. That's made there on purpose. We happen to have 10 Conestoga wagons here in our collection, and many of them have this nice decoration on here. That was so if you take your hand across there, it wouldn't break the boards out or ruin the whole thing. But this is over 200 years old, so you can expect it's had some rough treatment in all those years. Now that is simply a Pennsylvania decoration on there that originated over in Switzerland from those people where our ancestors came. This is a grease pot. That is a grease pot. They had to grease these wheels. This is called a linchpin wheel. There is not a bolt on there. There is not a thread on there. That's linchpin. Back here in this one has a hubcap. You think that hubcaps are something new on cars and trucks today. Well, some of these Conestoga wagons has hubcaps. There it is. This has 3 hubcaps on this wagon. It's the one that has any. But that one apparently was lost through the years. And so, also, here's a jack. As I said, this is called a linchpin gear. You notice that there's a notch in here. That's so that if they wanted to grease their wheel, all they had to do is get this jack and put it underneath and turn that up like that under the axle. And they have that wheel turn around, and they can lift that pin out of there without any trouble at all and put grease on it. This is called the grease pot or the tar pot. And the reason it's called the tar pot is the grease was made from a derivative of the pine tree in North Carolina. And you know what the people of North Carolina are called? They're called tar heels. And you say, well, people say to me, how often did you have to grease the wheels? Well, it depends how often they were used. See? And sometimes in wintertime, it was very cold and they wanted to grease their wheels maybe once a week, maybe twice a week or whatever. They might mix a little grease with the tar. And so that's called the tar pot. This is called a wheel drag that was put onto the wheels in the wintertime so they went down the hill. That would drag the wheel. They put the brake on. This is a brake mechanism here. They all had a brake. And so sometimes the teamster would have to walk beside and pull on the brake with one hand and drive the horses with the other hand. And so the toolbox was a necessary item because even tractor trailers and tractors today have toolboxes. They need those. The horses had to be fed, and here's how they were fed. This is called the feed box or the feed trough. And wasn't this smart? They could carry that with them. And so what they did, at mealtime when they'd feed these horses, usually feed them twice a day, they could get somebody to help them lift this off. That is very heavy. That box is very heavy. And they would extend this on the tongue. The tongue would be sticking out the front with horses on each side. And it would be placed on that tongue so that the horses could eat their feed out of there just as though they were at home at the trough in the barn. Okay? It's only the end gate that usually came off here. There are a few Conestoga wagons I've seen where the front end gate and the back end gate can both come off. But most of them have it just the end gate on the back. Can you imagine how difficult it was to load barrels, big heavy barrels, full of whatever it was, sugar, or a lot of times China was brought over and packed in sawdust on the ships, and they were met at the wharfs later on. My grandfather, who lived here, was the first one to raise tobacco in Lancaster County on a large scale, and probably in Pennsylvania on a large scale. He built the first building here to hang tobacco in 1875, and he used to sell his tobacco, and he would haul some of it to Philadelphia on a Conestoga wagon. It would take 5 days to walk down there to go with these horses and go down to Philadelphia and then load it on a clipper ship, and the ship would leave the port of Philadelphia and sail the whole way around the tip of South America because there was no Panama Canal at that time. And then he would come back. And my great-grandfather Landis had a mill and a beautiful big farm, and he sold flour and took flour in barrels to Philadelphia. And he said it took him 5 days to go down and 5 days to come back. And my grandmother used to say that if he'd stop at a tavern along the road, and there were many of them along the road, and that's 60 miles from here to Philadelphia, if he'd stop at a tavern, first before he ate his meal, he'd go see whether the kitchen was clean. And he was so particular because he had a grist mill, ground flour, and he wouldn't let men chew tobacco and spit tobacco in his mills. He kicked them out if they weren't clean. And she said that he'd stop at the hotels, at the taverns. He looked in the kitchen, and if the kitchen wasn't clean, he wouldn't eat there. He'd go on to another one, try to find another one. So these wagons have very high wheels, as you can see. Very high wheels. That's because a large wheel goes over a bump and through a ditch and over stumps and things like that much more easily than a vehicle in very small wheels. So we can tell the age of Conestoga wagons, at least I can. I can tell by the way these wheels are made, by the fellies on the wheels. This is called a felly, between here to here. That's called a felly. And because these are tapered like that, I can tell that's a sign that they're very old. They're made that way so when they went through the mud and the streams that the mud would fall off, it wouldn't pack on there. Weren't they smart? They figured all these things out. And so this is basically just a freight vehicle, and this is probably the most valuable one in the world, in our opinion. And we have 2 of them that were in the Hershey Museum and supposedly used to haul troops of wood, supplies to Washington's troops. Would one of you girls ring the bells? The horses had bells on, as we'll see up here in this picture. Ring the bells. It took 3 people to make a wagon like this, and it took them possibly 3 months. The wheelwright was the one who made the wheels, of course. It took a specialist to make those, a special person. Then it took the blacksmith to do the ironing. There's a great deal of iron on these wagons, around the axles, around the brake mechanism, all these things. There's a lot of chains, beautiful chains, all sorts of chains, pommels, everything else. So and the axe holder. These are all made by the blacksmith. Then there was the person who did the woodwork. So there were actually 3 people that made the Conestoga wagons, and there's scarcely a half a dozen Conestoga wagons that I know of that has the maker's name on. There's a man here in Lancaster County that made a wagon. His name was Hirsch, A.S. Hirsch. And he says, A.S. Hirsch Builder. So it came out of his shop. And at Landis Valley Museum, just a mile away, there's another one of his wagons, and it has the same thing on. And he did something that most wagon makers did not do, wagon makers of Conestoga wagons. He put his toolbox on the right-hand side. Mostly all Conestoga wagons have toolboxes on the left-hand side. That's because that's close to the teamster who's on the left side with his horse. But there are a few that have some on the right-hand side, and I had a wagon that had a beautiful toolbox on the front of it, and I sold that to a museum in Texas about 35 years ago. But these were made by 3 different craftsmen. And some people says, well, how long did it take to make one? Well, it depends how long they were working. They didn't work 8 hours a day. they worked long hours, and they worked hard. Most of the people that lived at that time worked harder in the morning before breakfast than most people do all day. So it probably took about 3 months to make a complete wagon.